The brutal murder of an obscure Canadian poet. Her closest friend who hides a terrible secret.
There are so many things I have never told anyone.
And the biographer struggling to find the truth.
You were the last person to see Mary Swan alive.
Miranda Richardson.
You use people, you know that?
And Brenda Fricker.
You're not gonna die, Rose.
Star in Swan. Sunday at 10:10 on BBC Two.
Why should the Opera House get money when my local hospital needs kidney machines?
Well, of course I could see there were difficult times ahead, but I didn't jump, I was pushed.
Financially, we are in crisis.
An arrogance that simply took the breath away.
It's a shambles, isn't it? I feel as though I'm intruding into a private club which is tolerating my presence with difficulty.
I defy Peter Mandelson to put good spin on that lot.
Trouble at the House, Monday at 9:30 on BBC Two.
This is BBC Two with Newsnight and Jeremy Paxman.
Good evening. There's been no more disturbing public inquiry in recent years as that into how a gang of white racists stabbed to death an innocent black teenager standing at a bus stop in South London. The scenes at that inquiry, the swaggers of the young suspects, the defiance of black Muslims, the unprecedented apology from the police, have thrown light on a side of British life we'd all prefer to forget. Tonight we're going to explore what this inquiry has told us about ourselves with the Assistant Commissioner who says he can't think of a murder inquiry which has been as badly handled as this one, with Stephen Lawrence's father, with black and white policemen talking about whether the police are intrinsically racist, and with others who've experienced racism at first hand. 56 days of the most extraordinary public inquiry in recent history will end on Monday. It produced the unprecedented sight of a senior officer in the Metropolitan Police apologising to the family of Stephen Lawrence. We're going to explore the broader questions raised in a moment, but before that, the nub of the issue, the failure of the police to put anyone behind bars. Robin Denslow reports.
Stephen Lawrence was 18 when he was murdered here in Wellhall Road, Eltham, south-east London, on the night of April the 22nd, 1993. He was with his friend Dwayne Brooks and was on his way home after visiting relatives. They were attacked without warning by 5 or 6 white youths shouting racial insults. Stephen was surrounded and stabbed, but staggered up the hill, badly bleeding, before he collapsed. Dwayne Brooks got away and reached a phone box to dial 999. According to Brooks, he told police where the murderers had fled, but no use was made of this information. At the inquiry, one officer agreed that Brooks himself was regarded not as a victim, but a potential suspect.
Okay.
Police complained they were faced with a wall of silence when information was coming in, pointing to the 5 suspects who were later arrested. One informant, known as James Grant, came forward within 24 hours of the murder. Assistant Commissioner Ian Johnston told the inquiry that Grant was clearly a key witness. Yet at the time it seems he was dismissed by the police and seen by no one more important than a detective sergeant. Grant was not the only witness to point to the 5 suspects. 4 days after the murder, police had been given 20 pieces of information suggesting they were responsible. Yet no arrests were made. The police also mishandled surveillance. It didn't even begin until after the weekend following the murder. 2 suspects were seen leaving this house carrying plastic bags that could have included blood-stained clothes or weapons, but the police photographer couldn't raise the alarm because he didn't have a mobile phone. The police agreed this was regrettable. Yet another mistake involved contact with the Lawrence family, who complained they were not being told enough about the murder investigation. The inquiry learned how some police felt about them, with the revelation of a letter to the Commissioner himself from Deputy Assistant Commissioner DJ Osland. It read, "Our patience is wearing thin with the Lawrence family. I'm totally satisfied that the Lawrence family have received a professional, sensitive and sympathetic service." And then there was the Metropolitan Police's own study of how their investigation had been handled, conducted by Chief Superintendent Barker in November '93. It concluded, The investigation has been progressed satisfactorily and all lines of inquiry correctly pursued. The inquiry chairman, Sir William Macpherson, was not impressed. We feel we ought to indicate that this review is likely to be regarded by us as indefensible. Criticism of the police didn't end there. The inquiry learned of a mysterious meeting at this Chislehurst pub. Clifford Norris, the father of one of the suspects and himself now a convicted criminal, was being followed by a customs team when he was spotted here meeting with a police officer. The matter was reported to police and there was an internal inquiry. The Lawrence inquiry was told this led to no disciplinary action but to words of advice. Later, during the private prosecution of 3 of the suspects, this same officer was assigned to look after Dwayne Brooks, the key witness who was with Stephen Lawrence when he was murdered. We met Brooks, who said he was too frightened to be interviewed while Lawrence's killers are still at large. It's surprising that the officer concerned, David Coles, was not asked to give evidence, and then neither was the key witness, the so-called James Grant. The 5 suspects were forced to answer questions and afterwards were attacked by an angry crowd outside. There's been no justice in the case of Stephen Lawrence, and the inquiry chairman must decide if the police failures were simply the result of incompetence or whether racism or even corruption were also factors. His recommendations will be studied closely by the police and by the black community.
Well, although he wasn't actually serving in the Metropolitan Police at the time, Stephen Lawrence was murdered on the patch of Assistant Commissioner Ian Johnston. It was he, therefore, who had to explain the police failure. Assistant Commissioner, can you think of a murder investigation that the Met has handled worse than they've handled the Stephen Lawrence investigation?
No, I can't, but neither can I think of a murder investigation which has been subject to such rigorous and proper examination. The Kent investigation looked at this for something like 9,000 man-hours, and the public inquiry has taken significantly longer.
Now, your apology to the Lawrence family, was that an apology for incompetence or for racism?
It was an apology, in essence, for not giving them the type of service that they expect from the Metropolitan Police.
So it's incompetence?
In essence, well, it's for a range of issues. We need to provide a service to Londoners, black and white, which they find appropriate and satisfactory. And it is evident from this inquiry, from the PCA investigation, that we didn't actually meet that criteria.
How many people have been disciplined for the incompetence shown in that investigation?
Right, well, as you all know, that the majority of the senior investigating officers, in fact all the senior investigating officers, have retired because this was a case in 1993, some 5 years ago. There is one serving officer who is, on the recommendations of the Police Complaints Authority, currently being considered for discipline.
So one person may be disciplined. If the other officers had not retired, would they have been disciplined?
There is clearly it's sort of prejudging the issue in a sense, and the full deliberations around that haven't been considered, but it's fair to say there is a high probability.
How do you square that with the fact that Assistant Commissioner Osland sent a letter to the Commissioner in which he said, I am totally convinced the Lawrence family have received a professional, sensitive and sympathetic service from the police. It wasn't professional, it wasn't sensitive and it wasn't sympathetic, was it?
No, he was wrong in relation to all of those matters, and I think we now all realise that he was wrong, and indeed, as you all know, I've held similar views myself, which equally I now accept are wrong.
But isn't it the fact that had there not been a public inquiry, you would still be maintaining that it was professional, sensitive and sympathetic?
No, I don't think we would. I think the police complaints investigation conducted by Kent revealed a number of things wrong with the investigation process. The Barker Review, for all its shortcomings, made a number of recommendations about family liaison and how we manage that process. It made a number of comments about the need for expedition in relation to murder investigations. And we've done actually a great deal since 1993 to make sure that things like this don't happen again.
Isn't the real reason that Assistant Commissioner Osland wrote that letter contained in his sentence, our patience is wearing thin with the Lawrence family and their representatives?
Well, I don't claim to represent Mr. Osland's views around any of this. My view is that the Lawrence family deserves sympathy and understanding, and that it's not our purpose in life to be publicly critical of them. I have no desire to do that. I have no basis for doing that. I think they are aggrieved parents who've lost their son. I have a 19-year-old son. If I'd lost him in the circumstances that they have, and no result had come in, as it's happened in this case, I would be equally bitter and sad about it.
Of course, I mean, your 19-year-old son is white.
Yes.
And isn't it really the case that had Stephen Lawrence been white, the inquiry would not have been conducted in the way it was conducted?
I think if you're meaning in the sense that this inquiry was flawed totally because Stephen was a black boy rather than a white boy, no, I generally don't believe that to be the case. If you're saying that individual interactions were insensitive and there was a lack of racial awareness in some of the encounters, I think that's exactly the sort of the thing that the public inquiry is looking into and will come to some conclusion about.
So you are seriously trying to tell me that had Stephen Lawrence been white, you would still have failed to put anybody behind bars for his killing?
I think it's very, very difficult to look back on this case and conclude whether there would be a different outcome if different things had happened. I think one of the serious problems that they faced in this case was a lack of evidence. This was a stranger murder. Most murders are committed by people who are known to each other. The victim and the assailant are known. This wasn't. This was an attack in the street, an unpremeditated attack in a sense. In that there doesn't appear to have been any prior planning for it. So the opportunities for evidence gathering in this case are restricted. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't some incompetence. It's not to say that we shouldn't have done better. But I think overall this case was not flawed in terms of the whole investigative process because Stephen was a black boy.
Was it just incompetence then that the key witness was put in the charge of a police officer who was known to be well acquainted with the father of one of the suspects?
Yes, I think the occasion that you're talking about is as part of a protected witness scheme, as part of our efforts to make sure that a particular witness, who was a critical witness in this case, received proper care, he was subjected to protection by a number of officers. On the day after this particular individual had given evidence at the Old Bailey, when his contribution to that process was finished, he was put in the company of an officer who has some connections, and in my view entirely inappropriate connections, with Clifford Norris. Now, I think that is...
The father of one of the suspects.
I think that is extremely unfortunate. I think it's wrong.
When you hear Mrs. Lawrence saying that this case has convinced her that no black person should contemplate joining the Metropolitan Police because it is endemically racist, she's got a point, hasn't she?
No, we have to accept what she says, and it's very sad to hear her say that. Fortunately, we have a number of black police officers who don't share that view. Fortunately, they are staying with us, doing a very good job, and we're making big efforts to make sure that we do recruit more black colleagues to join the Metropolitan Police. But it is very sad to hear her say that. We have an uphill struggle to regain her confidence.
How much damage do you think this has done to the Met?
Enormous amount of damage. There is really a lot of ground to be recovered. Massive challenge for us. What I would say is that we're ready for that challenge. We've already taken steps in relation to that challenge, and the appointment of Mr. Grieve, the former head of the terrorist branch, with all his investigation and credibility, I think is a significant step. We totally reorganised the way we investigate murders. We are modifying our training in relation to racial awareness. There are a whole battery of things that we're doing to try and regain Londoners' confidence, but I don't underestimate the size of the challenge.
Well, we're joined now by Mike Bennett of the Police Federation, by Inspector Paul Wilson of the Black Police Association, by Barry Mussenden of the Stephen Lawrence Family Campaign, and by Neville Lawrence, Stephen's father. What do you make of that protestation by the Assistant Commissioner, Mr. Lawrence?
Well, after 5 years of suffering and seeing some of the evidence that we have seen over the 53 weeks or 55 weeks, I'm surprised the Commissioner is still, the acting Commissioner is still not convinced that there's racism, corruption, and still saying that if my son was a white youth, this wouldn't be happening. I find that very disappointing.
Just explain how you characterise this racism. You're not suggesting that there was an active obstruction of the investigation because people were prejudiced, the investigating officers were prejudiced against black people, are you? Or that they were blind, or what?
I'm saying that I sat there and heard officers saying that it wasn't a racist killing, and after 5 years they're still saying that. So in order to them to get the result, they had to accept that it was a racist killing, and look for people who did racist things to black people.
And they were willfully blind, in your view?
I think they just closed their eyes to the facts and didn't look for the people who actually killed my son.
Now, why did they close their eyes?
Because they don't want to accept that they are racist people. And you can see from all the excuses that they use while I sat there and listened. Some of the times I had to get up and leave the room because I couldn't believe that a professional person who was supposed to do their job wasn't doing their job because of their views.
Mike Bennett, presumably your belief is that it was just incompetence.
There was certainly incompetence. The top end of the Metropolitan Police screwed up, totally. And it's not surprising to me that the only person who is facing discipline charges is a detective inspector. Now, one assumes that had he retired, they'd have gone for the next lowest rank onwards. And we would like to see a bit more accountability at the top.
Do you believe with the Assistant Commissioner that had the victim been white, there would still be nobody who've been convicted for his killing?
For my knowledge, I do, yes. Sadly, for a murder inquiry, you need evidence. The names of suspects is not evidence. And to this day, no evidence has come to light.
Come on, the mistakes were there right through. They didn't give first aid when they arrived on the scene. They didn't follow up witness leads. They didn't even know, the senior officer didn't even know the circumstances under which he could arrest somebody.
Dwayne Brooks told the first officers on the scene, and the first officer on the scene was an off-duty policeman. That doesn't signify racism to me. He told the first officer on the scene that Stephen had been hit by an iron bar. There was no blood at the scene that the police officer could see. The police officer in uniform who arrived and tried to assist Stephen was given a discipline notice for failing to find the fatal wound. 2 paramedics who attended the scene also failed to find the fatal wound until Stephen was lifted.
Mr. Lawrence, did you believe the police were racist before your son was stabbed?
Well, if you look at the background in which my son died, there's been 3 other murders in that same vicinity. One of the questions which I asked in the very first beginning when I saw these people were, what about the people who were involved with the murder just 300 yards down the road from where my son was killed? Have you questioned them? And they said, no, they don't do things like that. So from the minute, if this was a white person, from the minute that person was killed, they would have rounded up all those black people who were involved in that murder down the road, 6 or 7 months before. And they would have to give account of what they were doing that night.
Inspector Wilson, you are obviously black, you're also an inspector. You speak for the Black Police Association. Do you believe the police are institutionally racist?
What the Black Police Association hopes is that this inquiry, which we support, by the way, we support the endeavours of this inquiry, we support the Lawrence family, we would disassociate ourselves with the views of Mike Bennett and the Police Federation in this matter. What we, the Black Police Association, hope is that this inquiry really elevates people's understanding of what we mean by institutional racism, and indeed racism.
Can you explain what you mean? Because you do believe that there is institutional racism in the police.
I believe there's institutional racism within the BBC. I believe there's institutional racism in the police.
Can you explain what you mean by institutional racism?
I think during the Scarman inquiry, the notion of racist conduct really revolved around a few rotten apples, and that was the overt acts of racist conducts by a few people, and that was considered to be racism. Now I think we're beginning to see that the institutional racism underpins, if you like, the organisation. And what we mean by institutional racism is the fact that as police officers we tend to get involved with a very skewed cross-section of society, and that has the potential really for creating a number of stereotypes around particular groups. Now, unfortunately, those stereotypes become common culture, common currency within the police occupational culture. Now, if the predominantly white police officers have no other interactions with minority groups than those negative interactions at work, then those negative stereotypes can take on quite a formidable meaning.
Do you recognise that picture of your trade?
I didn't understand a word of that. It sounded like a script. The bottom line is that, let me just show you tonight's front page of the Evening Standard. A black man is murdered. His aorta is cut in 2 places. Blood is pouring out. The first officer on the scene gives him the kiss of life, has no hope whatsoever of saving that man's life. That happened on Wednesday of this week. Does that signify to the rest of the country and to the people of London that we are racist, that we didn't want to get the blood of a black man on our hands? I would have hoped that after tonight, Mr. Lawrence, in order to try and heal the wounds, because it's going to take both sides, would accept that we are not endemically racist. We have racists within our ranks, but we're not endemically racist. And also take away that stain where he said that police officers did not want to get the blood of a black man on their hands. That is the worst defamation I have heard in 37 years as a police officer.
That comment?
I didn't make that comment, did I?
Would you take it away, though?
No,
it was said on your
If he
behalf.
didn't make it, he can't take it. But Inspector Wilson's point is a much more subtle one. It is that if your experience of a particular community is largely on the receiving end of the attentions of the law, inevitably that skews your perception of them.
I can only speak personally. It's never skewed my perception of them. The very first member of the public that I ever spoke to in 1962, I had been on the streets for 5 minutes. I'd come out of Cannon Road Police Station, walking up Whitehall, past the Cenotaph. I was told to stop a car. Terribly nervous. I stopped a car. The driver was black. His first words to me were, "You only stopped me because I'm black." 37 years later, we are still going down that road.
How do we account for the differential treatment up and down the country, not just in London, of black people? The statistics produced by the Home Office would indicate that black people are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be treated differently by the police. Now, that can't be through the acts of a few rotten apples. And I go back to the institutional racism that is prevalent within the police. It's prevalent within many public services.
You're much more likely to be stopped by the police as a black person, as you say. All the evidence supports that. But what interests me is how you, as a black person within the police, exist within what you consider to be an institutionally racist culture.
There are very few black police officers. There are 800 within London, and I use the term generically. We describe black as meaning ethnic minority. There are 800 ethnic minorities police officers within the police service. There are 27,000 police officers within London, so that just puts that in perspective. There are 19 senior black officers. Going back to a point that was made earlier about black people joining the police, I don't think it's sufficient just for black people to join the police. Black people want to see black police officers having some sort of career, having some sort of power, having some say in how the community is treated.
Does that reassure you at all, Mr. Lawrence?
Well, I'm looking down this road after 5 years, and as I say, you know, what this black police officer is saying is exactly what we've been saying, that we should be treated fairly and not because of our colour. And we have another police officer here saying that the way he deals with the black population is completely different, and I've made it plain to even some of the officers which I've accused. What are you saying?
I didn't say that at all.
What are you saying?
Well, I haven't mentioned my dealings with the black community.
You've said that you stopped a black person in a car.
37 years ago, I stopped a car. The car was at least 100 yards away. I was more nervous than anybody. It was my first few minutes on the streets. The driver, eventually, he was black. His first words to me, before I said a word to him, was, "You've only stopped me because I'm black." And here we are, 37 years later, and we're no further forward, and we should be.
Right, I want to explore that in just a moment or two, because it is 5 years since Stephen Lawrence was murdered. Time enough, one might have hoped for things to have improved. But it is a sad and salutary fact of life that racism is still alive. In some places, suspicion of endemic racism in the police and councils is so ingrained that local monitoring groups have been set up. Robin Denslow reports again from South London.
This Asian woman lives with her 4 teenage children just a mile from where Stephen Lawrence was murdered, on an estate where several of the suspects have also been living. Her family are concerned for their safety. They've suffered racial harassment and sporadic attacks since last autumn. She and her eldest son, who both said they were too frightened to be identified, complained the police had not done enough to help.
We rang them on one occasion, and that was when they said to me that, you know, to come down to the station, or they haven't got any units free to come down to the house at the moment. And that's going to be at least a good couple of hours wait. This was about 10:30, 11 o'clock I'd phoned them. So it goes, an officer's not going to be down till about 12, 1 o'clock to see you about it at all.
They wouldn't come here,
No.
and they asked you to go to the police station.
And they said, if you want to make a report, we can always come down and make it here.
And this was at a time when there was trouble going on outside?
Yeah, it was when they was throwing stones at my house about 11 o'clock at night as well.
Well, when they hit the girls, we had to go at them. Then it stopped. I thought that was the end of it, until the police came and raided our house.
Her son showed me what happened. Police raided the house in February, checking upstairs in his bedroom, saying they were looking for guns. The family complained the police never turned up when they asked for help, though they had one visit from the school's liaison officer, but they got raided instead.
Broken my bed, I mean, all my wardrobe and that had been, gone through as if, you know, they'd let a madman in there and he's just throwing things about. So they came with a search warrant saying that they're looking for firearms and ammunition in my house. And there was asked them, you know, who reported it. They said it was them kids.
Did you have a gun?
No.
So what's your overall attitude to the police now?
They've gone mad. They don't care.
The police insist that they were only informed last month that the family were being racially harassed. As for the raid, they were acting correctly after a tip-off.
Now that premises were searched and no gun was found, but there was clear indications of an obsession with offensive weapons at the premises.
It may well have been, surely, that one of those involved in the racial harassment tipped off someone to try and get a raid to harass them further. Is that a possibility?
There are a number of explanations as to how this came about. Clearly we can only act on what we know and what we're told. The assessment was made at that time, on the 11th of June, that it would be inappropriate for police to attend the premises. I'm quite happy to review that situation now.
But police here insist they're taking racially motivated crime very seriously. They have a special racial incident unit based in Woolwich and set up 3 years before Lawrence was killed. It's been praised for good practice by a parliamentary select committee. When we visited last week, they were preparing to make arrests.
At about 5:40 p.m, an argument's taken place between a white family and a Somali family.
The officer in charge put on a bulletproof vest before setting off. They deal with roughly 360 incidents a year here. Today's case is typical.
We're dealing with a Somali man that's been seriously assaulted. He was struck in the face with a bottle following an argument between two families in early May. Now we're in a position, having made a number of inquiries and spoken with the witnesses, and we've identified an address which is very close to where the actual victim lives.
So you're pretty sure who did it?
We are.
But the suspect was not at home, and neither were the suspects at two other addresses they visited. It's not been a good month for police in southeast London. One officer told me privately, we'll never recover from the Lawrence affair. Morale has certainly been hit, but as police wait to learn what recommendations result from the Lawrence inquiry, the official